The distance between living paycheck to paycheck forever and beginning to build real wealth is much smaller than most people think. It is not $1 million. It is not even 100,000. For most ordinary people, the first line that truly matters is far lower than that. It is the moment you stop relying on labor alone and begin owning enough capital for money to join you in the work. That is the line, not because it is impossible, because the part before it feels so slow, so ordinary, and so unrewarding that they quit right before the arithmetic starts becoming interesting. If I were 25 again, with an ordinary income, no special title, and no inherited cushion, I would think about wealth in a way that would probably disappoint people looking for something glamorous. I would not begin with stock tips. I would not begin with economic forecasts. I would not begin with the fantasy that one heroic investment will rescue a life built on weak habits. I would begin with a number $15,000, not because $15,000 makes anyone rich, it does not, but because it is the point where your relationship with money starts to change. Before that point, almost everything depends on your restraint. After that point, capital begins to carry a small part of the load. That sounds minor. It is not minor at all. It is the beginning of a completely different life. I have spent most of my life watching people misunderstand wealth. They think wealth is created in the dramatic part of the story, the big stock pick, the booming business, the clever trade, the lucky break. That is not where it begins. It begins in a place so dull that most people cannot stay there long enough to benefit from it. It begins in the flat part of the curve. That is the part where you do all the work and your money does almost nothing you save. You wait. You watch the number creep upward in a way that feels almost insulting. You make sacrifices that nobody applauds. You drive the old car. You skip the impressive vacation. You say no when other people say yes. And after months of discipline, what do you have to show for it? A number still small enough to make you question whether the effort means anything. That is where most financial futures die. Not in a crash, not in a recession, not in some elaborate fraud. They die in boredom, they die in impatience, they die because the early phase of compounding does not flatter the human ego. People want the score to move quickly enough to make them feel clever. Real wealth does not care about your need to feel clever, it cares whether the math is being fed. Suppose a person saves $400 a month. That is not glamorous. It is not the kind of number that excites anyone on the internet. At the end of a year, that person has put away $4,800 before returns. That may turn into roughly $5,000 with modest gains. Now picture how most people experience that. They think, I worked for 12 months, passed up pleasures, resisted temptation, and all I have is $5,000. Then they do the wrong math. They think linearly. If a year produces $5,000, then real wealth must be decades away, and they begin persuading themselves that the effort is pointless. That is one of the costliest mistakes in finance. People look at an exponential curve and judge it by its earliest inches. They abandon the process because the first stretch is nearly flat. They never stay long enough to see what the curve does later. That is why I care so much about the first $15,000. It is not mystical. It is mechanical. At $1,000, a decent return does very little for you. At $5,000, it is still barely visible. At $15,000, it starts to matter. Not enough to retire you. Enough to prove that capital is no longer a decoration. It has become a participant. That psychological change is more important than most people realize. Before a person saves serious money, he often thinks of himself as someone who is permanently exposed. One bad month hurts, one repair hurts, one medical bill hurts. One spell of unemployment becomes a full emotional crisis. He is living without ballast. He may be hardworking, honest, and intelligent, but his financial life still feels fragile because he has no real buffer against reality. Then he reaches the first meaningful threshold. The number itself is not what matters most. What matters is what it says. It says he is no longer starting over from zero every month. It says he can absorb small shocks without panic. It says his life is beginning to contain optionality. That changes behavior. When people have no cushion, They make desperate decisions. When they finally have one, they can say no, no to the humiliating offer, no to the bad debt, no to the investment. They do no to the purchase designed only to impress people who are not paying their bills. That is why the first pile matters so much. It does not merely change the spreadsheet, it changes the owner. I have known people with high salaries who never built wealth. I have also known people with moderate salaries who became financially formidable. The public likes to blame income for everything. Income matters, of course, but it is not the whole story, and very often not even the decisive part of the story. A household earning $40,000 and saving consistently can move toward wealth. A household earning $200,000 and spending everything can remain fragile forever. Arithmetic does not care how prestigious your job sounds when you describe it at a party. Arithmetic cares what is left after consumption. The world would rather sell you a more flattering explanation. It would rather tell you that wealth is inaccessible without a special background, some secret network or a life. Changing break. Sometimes those things help. They are not the foundation. The foundation is much less glamorous. Spend less than you earn. Keep doing it. Do not interrupt the process stupidly. That is the foundation. It is so simple that many people dismiss it as too basic to be useful. That is another error. Simple is not the same as easy. The difficulty of wealth building is almost never conceptual. It is behavioral. People understand what to do. They simply do not like it. It requires delayed gratification in a culture built to punish it. Everywhere you turn, the world is trying to convince you to consume your future in exchange for a temporary feeling. The advertisements are not just selling products. They are selling identity. They tell you that your life is behind schedule, that your car says something about your worth, that your home must be upgraded to match your age, that your children need evidence of prosperity, that your vacations must be visible, that moderation is for people who failed. This is one of the most expensive lies ever told. The person who keeps up appearances often destroys the very engine that could have created real freedom. A great many people spend the first half of life trying to look financially successful, and the second half discovering they have to keep working because they never became financially strong. That is not an accident. That is the price of confusing display with progress. I would rather be underestimated for 10 years than admired for 10 minutes. The trouble is that human beings are social animals. We look sideways, we compare, and comparison is gasoline poured onto bad financial behavior. Your neighbor buys a nicer vehicle. Your coworker upgrades his house. Your friend posts photographs that suggest a much easier life than the one you are living. Now your own plan begins to feel small. It begins to feel slow. It begins to feel humiliating. That is when people start ruining themselves. They stop asking whether their behavior moves them toward freedom and start asking whether it keeps them emotionally level with the people around them. That is a disastrous standard. You rarely know the balance sheet behind the display. The big house may be financed to the hilt. The luxury trip may be credit card debt in disguise. The appearance of acceleration may actually be a faster route to ruin. And even if the other person is genuinely richer, envy still does nothing useful for you. It does not improve your returns. It does not lower your spending. It does not increase your skills. It simply tempts you into abandoning a sound path in order to chase a path that may not even be real. One of the most intelligent financial decisions a person can make is to stop using other people's visible lives as data. Most of what you can see is costume. Wealth is not costume. Wealth is reserve. Wealth is room. Wealth is the ability to let time help you because you are not constantly forced into urgent choices. And none of that is visible from across the street. There is another trap I dislike even more than envy. Self-pity. Self-pity is a poison because it can masquerade as realism. A person says, "My start was too small, my income is too limited, the system is unfair, other people had advantages, the game was tilted long before I arrived." Some of that may be true. It still does not help. A truth that leaves you passive is an expensive truth to dwell on. I prefer inversion. Instead of asking what brilliant thing will make me rich, I ask what almost guarantees I will stay poor. The answers are not mysterious. Spend more than you earn. Carry expensive debt. Try to look successful before you are. Interrupt compounding unnecessarily. Take risks you do not understand. Resent other people instead of improving yourself. Stop learning. Refuse to be reliable. Marry your ego to your purchases. Those things will keep a person poor with astonishing consistency. Avoiding them does not make you a genius. It makes you less self-destructive. That alone can create a huge advantage over time. People often imagine that wealth belongs to the unusually brilliant. Sometimes brilliance helps, but over long stretches, I have seen many more fortunes built by people who were consistently rational than by people who were intermittently dazzling. This is why I place such high value on temperament. If you cannot tolerate slow progress, you will never reach the point where progress accelerates. If you cannot tolerate looking ordinary, you will never own enough assets to become extraordinary. If you cannot sit through the years when your savings do nearly all the lifting, you will never reach the years when capital begins carrying the heavier load. That crossover is where the world starts to feel different. At $15,000, your money is still young and weak, but it is no longer helpless. At $30,000, the contribution becomes more visible. At $75,000, the account starts to feel like an ally. At $150,000, a reasonable return can equal the entire threshold that once seemed enormous. That is how wealth begins to compound in a way ordinary people can feel. But nobody gets there without surviving the early years first. That is the cruel beauty of it. The first stage demands almost all the sacrifice and offers almost none of the applause. You must do it because it is right, not because it is instantly rewarding. That is also why leverage seduces so many people at exactly the wrong time. A person has 8,000, then 10,000, then 12. He grows restless. He has been patient long enough to become dangerous, not because he is close to success, because he is close enough to success to become impatient with the remaining distance. That is when he starts hunting for shortcuts, borrowed money, aggressive speculation, trades he cannot survive, narratives he does not understand. A person can lose years of discipline in one burst of impatience. Leverage is especially treacherous because it flatters the mind before it punishes the balance sheet. When it works, it convinces you that you have finally found the fast lane. Then reality moves against you, and you discover that the fast lane had no guardrail. I have never felt the need to get rich 4 times. Once is enough, and once only requires that you avoid being carried out of the game. The person who builds the first meaningful pile without leverage owns something no lender can call back. That matters. It matters more than the public understands. Money you truly own behaves differently from money that can vanish because a margin clerk becomes nervous. There is a second engine people neglect while they obsess over returns. Earning power savings rate matters, but earning power matters too. If a person keeps learning, keeps becoming more useful, keeps improving the quality and reliability of his work, his income need not remain fixed forever. This is one of the reasons I have always admired readers. A person who keeps learning compounds in 2 directions at once. His capital compounds, his capability compounds, and the second form of compounding often feeds the first. The world pays more for rare usefulness than for good intentions. If you become more useful, more trusted, more competent, more dependable, your earning power usually improves. Then your savings capacity improves. Then the engine gets more fuel. That is why I dislike static thinking. A person says, I only earn this much, so this is all I will ever be able to save. That may be true for one season. It does not have to be true forever. The great advantage of skill is that it travels with you. No one can inflate it away. No market crash can mark it down overnight. No recession permanently destroys the value of a person who keeps becoming harder to replace. That does not mean everyone will become wealthy through work alone. It means work can feed the first pile, and the first pile can then begin feeding itself. That is the handoff. That is what people should respect. Labor starts the engine. Capital gradually takes a larger role. Freedom is born somewhere in the transition. I also want to say something about complexity, because many people lose money trying to sound sophisticated. The financial world makes a great deal of money from confusion. The more complicated the pitch, the more impressive it can seem. But complexity often serves the seller more than the buyer. Most people do not need cleverness. They need consistency. They need to avoid debt that eats them alive. They need to automate saving. They need to own assets they understand. They need to stop interrupting the process every time fear or excitement shows up. They need fewer decisions, not more. A simple system, faithfully followed, beats an elaborate one that changes with the owner's moods. That is as true for a school teacher as it is for an executive. Now let me tell you why I care about this threshold even more right now than I would in a perfectly ordinary decade. Because we are not in a perfectly ordinary decade. The world has built up a great mountain of debt. Governments owe too much. Consumers, in many cases, owe too much. Businesses, in many cases, have grown too dependent on easy financing. And when debt rises high enough, the future becomes less forgiving. A system can float along on debt for years, sometimes decades, because the strain remains hidden under optimism, low rates, and the belief that someone powerful can always smooth things over. Then eventually the math changes. Interest becomes heavier. Refinancing becomes harder. Policymakers are forced into uglier choices, and people discover that the old assumptions do not work as cleanly as they did before. That is when capital matters even more. In easy periods, having no reserve is uncomfortable. Having no reserve is dangerous. The person with no savings enters a difficult cycle as prey. He is forced to sell labor on bad terms. He is forced to liquidate under pressure. He cannot wait for opportunity because he has no room to wait. He becomes a victim of timing. The person who has even a modest capital base enters the same period differently. He is not rich, but he is not empty-handed. He can withstand more, he can see more, he can buy when others must sell. That is why the first meaningful threshold is not just about compounding, it is about position. A crisis does not merely punish the careless, it transfers assets from those who are unprepared to those who are liquid and patient enough to take the other side. The public tends to notice only the violence of the crash. I notice the transfer. When the pressure becomes severe, fire sale prices appear in places that seemed unreachable only months before. A business becomes available at a sane valuation. A property owner needs cash. A distressed seller accepts terms that would have been laughed at in better times. The person with capital gets invited into conversations the person without capital never even hears about. That is another reason 15,000 matters. It is not because 15,000 buys a dream life. It is because it moves you from total exclusion into partial participation. It allows you to begin entering the virtuous cycle. Capital attracts opportunity. Opportunity, handled well, creates more capital. That process looks unfair from the outside. It is often simply arithmetic. I do not say that to glorify inequality. I say it because I want ordinary people to understand that the first task is not to admire the cycle from afar. The first task is to enter it, and entry begins with the first real pile. There is an emotional mistake people make once they finally cross that line. They celebrate too early, they feel relief, and immediately try to turn relief into lifestyle. That is premature. The first meaningful pile is not a finish line. It is a foothold. The intelligent thing to do after reaching it is not to inflate your life. It is to protect the habits that built it. Keep expenses flatter than income. Keep learning. Keep adding. Keep the process boring. The temptation is to convert evidence of progress into visible consumption. That is how the curve gets interrupted. Every dollar that leaves the compounding machine to feed vanity becomes a worker you permanently laid off. People underestimate how much damage small lifestyle expansions can do. A more expensive car payment is not just a monthly bill. It is a recurring withdrawal from future freedom. The bigger home is not merely a bigger home. It is years of optionality traded for square footage you may not even need. The rewards of discipline are sweetest when they are left inside the machine long enough to multiply. I would also resist the urge to watch the account too often. Frequent checking invites needless action. The more often people look, the more likely they are to respond to noise as though it were information. A portfolio is not a tomato plant that grows faster because you stare at it. Give good decisions room to work. Do not keep uprooting them to inspect the roots. That is one of the quiet advantages of a calm financial life. Less drama, less reaction, more time, more compounding. If I had to reduce everything I know about early wealth building to a handful of lines for an ordinary person, it would sound almost embarrassingly plain. Spend less than you earn. Build the first pile with stubborn consistency. Avoid expensive debt. Avoid envy. Avoid self-pity. Avoid leverage. You cannot survive. Keep learning so your earning power rises. Do not buy things to impress people who are not financing your future. Do not interrupt compounding to relieve temporary emotions. That is the playbook. It is not flashy. It works. And right now it matters more because the world is entering a period where financial strength will be tested less by brilliance than by preparation. When debt-heavy systems begin to strain, the people with no reserve become desperate very quickly. The people with even modest reserve become calm enough to behave rationally. That difference widens outcomes. I do not know exactly when the next ugly turn will arrive. No one does. I do know that when it arrives, the person who has crossed from zero into capital will live through it differently from the person who has been consuming everything he earns. That difference is not theoretical. It is the difference between being forced and being able to choose. That is all wealth is in the end. Choice, not toys, not status, not noise. Choice, the ability to walk away from the wrong thing, the ability to wait for the right thing, the ability to handle an emergency without humiliation, the ability to let time work for you instead of feeling that time is constantly working against you. The first $15,000 does not buy complete freedom. It buys the beginning of freedom. That is enough to change a life. Most people remain on the wrong side of that line because they keep demanding emotional proof before the arithmetic has had time to produce visible proof. Do not make that mistake. The early stage will feel small. It will feel slow. You will question it. You will be tempted to spend the seed and call it enjoying life. You will watch other people appear to race ahead. Ignore all of that. Stay with the process long enough for the process to reveal itself. Once you cross the first meaningful threshold, your money begins whispering something new to you. It says, "I can help." At first the voice is quiet, then it becomes clearer. Then one day, if you have been patient and rational long enough, it carries more of the burden than you do. That is when the whole structure changes. But it only changes for people who survive the flat part. That is the test. Not intelligence, not background, not luck alone. The test is whether you can do simple things long enough with enough discipline to reach the point where simplicity becomes powerful. If I were starting from scratch today, that is exactly how I would think. I would not obsess over looking rich. I would obsess over crossing the line where capital begins to matter. I would protect my habits more than my image. I would treat the first meaningful threshold as sacred. And I would remember that the purpose of the whole exercise is not to die with the largest number. It is to live with the greatest amount of freedom. Freedom begins smaller than most people think. It begins with the first pile that changes who is carrying the weight. Build that pile, protect it. Then let time do what time has always done for people who are rational enough to work with it.